From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
D.C. is heading into week 3 of the federal government shutdown.
Both sides are very dug in. Everyone is kind of battened down for a long, potentially very long shutdown.
Where Michigan's congressional delegation stands. But first, Governor Gretchen Whitmer signed Michigan's new education budget on Monday.
It includes a record amount of per-pupil funding, along with additional money for mental health and school safety.
The budget also includes money for schools to continue to provide free breakfast and lunch to all students. But a lot of folks in Michigan's public education system see this as a mixed bag at best. Robert McCann is executive director of the K-12 Alliance, an organization of school district superintendents, and he joins us now. Bob, hi.
Hi, Zoe. Thanks for having me.
So, Bob, the last time we spoke was just past the July 1st deadline. It took another 3 months before the state budget was wrapped up. There was a lot of frustration, to say the least. Now that it's done, Bob, what are you hearing? What are school leaders' thoughts on the final product?
You know, it's on one hand, you're hearing some level of relief that they have some certainty now in terms of what funding they're going to have available this year. But at the same time, you're hearing a lot of concern from superintendents and school board members and others about what this really means for not just for this year in terms of our schools, but what it's going to mean going forward for the future of public education funding in Michigan. When you look at all of the ways that they are pulling money out of our K-12 school system to spend elsewhere, it's really setting up some concerns for the years ahead in terms of the stability of the funding system as a whole and what that's going to mean for the next generation of Michigan students.
For folks who may not understand exactly what you mean when saying moving money around, can you explain?
You know, about 15 years ago, we saw for the first time ever a legislature and governor agree to what they called at the time borrow money out of the school aid fund to pay for what at that point in time had been traditionally general fund obligations. Our school aid fund had been strictly spent on K through 12 schools while the general fund took care of the rest. And since that time, even though in 2010 it was called a loan out of it, it was, of course, never paid back and neither was it a one-time thing. It has been done every year since then and has grown year to year. This year, $1.35 billion was taken out of the school aid fund to spend on, again, what used to be general fund obligations. And it was done so with a $400 million increase over how much they spent last year because they needed a way to pay for a road funding plan. Unfortunately, they're doing it at the expense of our schools and our students, and that's, I don't think, what voters ultimately want, but it's how they put that plan together.
But the new annual foundation allowance, the per-student grant from the state, is more than $10,000 per student. That's a record high. That's got to be good news.
It's a record high, but still well behind where we're supposed to be at this point. If you look at any study done, Michigan has been thousands of dollars behind in its per pupil spending for quite a long time. So while lawmakers like to pat themselves on the back and say this is record funding, it's also true that it's nowhere near where we need to be. And in a lot of cases, schools are going to see a below inflation increase in their spending this year, meaning year to year, their spending in classrooms is going to go down as a result of this budget. And that's not something anybody should be proud of.
Well, what should the per-student foundation allowance be right now then?
If you look at it just from an inflationary standpoint, and that doesn't even account for the inflation costs that have been taken on by schools or the additional programming that the legislature requires of us, it's probably somewhere over 12,000 at this point, just looking at where we were 10 years ago versus now. So, yeah, you know, we're happy to be above 10,000. I don't think any school district is going to turn the money down, obviously, but at the same time, we're nowhere near where we need to be.
And yet what I hear from some folks who we talk to is that there is more money, and yet student reading scores, student scores in math are low and continuing to decline, and that more money is not fixing the problem.
And that's exactly my point in response, is that they are not investing the money it would take to actually give our students the resources that they deserve. If you want to actually solve the reading problems in this state, if you want to get our math scores up, a lot of the time, in many cases, we need to give our students that additional support that they may need outside of the traditional classroom setting. That means a reading coach, a tutor, that person that's going to give them that extra attention that gets them back on track where we want them to be. And when we are barely funding the basics within our classrooms with this state funding, that means that those additional support staffs often are not available. We cannot afford those tutors, the reading coaches. And until the state chooses to invest in the way that we need to invest in our classrooms, then it's not going to happen. And the accountability that they're calling for needs to be looked at within the Capitol, not within the classrooms, when they're not investing the money that we need.
You were talking about classroom resources, school resources. You mentioned reading coaches. What other folks or resources should be directed into schools that can't be because of this budget?
Yeah, there's a lot of different things. Reading coaches are often the most obvious one that we see, but there are tutors and social workers. These are people that may not be in the classroom on a daily basis, but are made available to students outside of their traditional classroom setting to get them caught back up, because we know what happens when a student falls behind is that either the teacher has to slow the entire class down to get that one student caught back up, or that student is simply going to get left behind. And it's when you can provide those additional resources to that one student or two students, whatever it may be, outside of the class and get them that extra help to get caught back up. That's when that student is going to get success and our scores are going to get where we need to be. But if a school doesn't have the resources to pay for those additional staff members, then unfortunately it leaves the school with few choices. And unfortunately, that's not in that kid's best interest. But again, when we're not investing the amount of resources we need to be, schools have to make difficult decisions like that.
Bob, a lot of attention during this process was paid to free school breakfast and lunch programs, likely because it was something that just has such a day-to-day impact on parents and students in schools. There were districts who put out statements earlier in the school year saying that they may not be able to provide these meals because of the delayed budget. Now that there is a budget in place and signed, are there districts in Michigan who are not delivering these meals?
I think everybody is back to being a operating under the free meal program. It's, the problem was that once again, without a budget being passed, schools had to make a lot of guesswork when they were reopening this year and do so conservatively, because the last thing any superintendent or school board member wanted to do was start spending money that ultimately wasn't going to be delivered to them, which meant that they would have then had to start pulling money from other programs to make up for that loss. And so, yeah, you did have school districts that were said, we have no guarantee that this money is going to be there. Therefore, we are going to tell you now that this program is going to go away. And now that that funding certainty is there, again, it's not ideal, but they're going to find a way, most likely, to scramble and get that program back up and running as quickly as they can. So, we're going to make it work however we can, but this is just another example of why that law exists in the first place, that the legislature has to, under the law, get a budget done by July 1. Schools are making their own decisions in June and July. The legislature is supposed to do the same, and they failed to do that. And that's really the cause of so much of that chaos and uncertainty that happened with not just the meal program, but certainly with that program this year.
One of the things that we heard about in the course of the budget is something that some people were complaining was kind of a shell game when it came to the Michigan Public School Employees Retirement System, which is sometimes called MIPSers. What's the problem there from your perspective?
Decades ago, based on some unfortunate choices made by Lansing, that system, the educator retirement system, went into debt. And in order to get it back into sustainability, they made some difficult choices, necessary choices at that point, which required both the state and local school districts to pay more money into that system, which means that, yes, a school is going to get $10,050 per pupil, but they are also going to turn around and send quite a bit of that money right back to Lansing to cover those debt payments within the system. And what Lansing chose to do this year is to essentially shirk part of their responsibility of that system and force those costs more onto local school districts, which means that, yes, you may be getting a little bit more money this year, but your payroll costs are going to go up at the same time. The net result of that is going to mean that while Lansing and lawmakers are going to point at a chart saying you got more money this year, we have a chart that's going to show, yes, but our costs went up at equal to, if not more than that. So many school districts will receive more money, but ultimately lose out as a result of their payroll costs going up because of this shift that lawmakers stuck into this budget in order to free up money for themselves to pay for a road plan. School costs go up. Our kids are going to pay for that just so that they could say that they were going to fix the roads.
How will this play out in terms of school spending this year and in future years?
The frustration for this year is that they're passing a budget in the middle of a school year. This is not how this should ever have been done. And if we had gotten this budget in, say, June, we probably could have made it work out okay anyway. But when you get a budget like this in October, it's very, very difficult for schools to make this work in a way that benefits their schools and their students. So it's really a mixed bag. And it's unfortunate that they didn't choose to do their jobs back in June and get this done then. But our bigger concern is really looking forward. We know the economy and what the numbers look like for next year. I mean, the legislature's own fiscal agencies are telling us that it's going to be a bad year next year. And when we look at this budget and look at that forecasting, it speaks volumes of the concerns that we're going to have for what the budget next year is going to look like, what the budget the year after. They've really set this budget up in such a fragile state that when we look forward, we have some serious, serious concerns about how they're going to put a budget together next year that doesn't involve serious cuts to some of the most basic programs of our schools.
Bob, finally, do you have any sense that lawmakers, that folks learned their lessons from this budget process and that next year might be different?
I'd like to say I hope so, but so far what we've seen is sort of some defiant statements come from certain parts of the legislature, saying that schools should have known they're going to get a budget eventually, so what's the big deal? And unfortunately, that represents a complete misunderstanding of how school funding works still. A budget is more than just the per pupil, and it's more than just the sum total that we see on a balance sheet. School funding is made up of a lot of different pieces, and if you don't know what all of them look like, it's very difficult for schools to make good decisions that benefit all of their students. And it doesn't seem like the legislature has necessarily learned that lesson, but we're going to certainly make it abundantly clearer as we move into the next budget cycle, which unfortunately is starting very soon, and demonstrate why it is so important for them to get this done on time this year. We can't go through this again.
Bob McCann, Executive Director of the K-12 Alliance. Bob, thanks so much for the time.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Bob.
After a failed vote in the U.S. Senate yesterday, the shutdown in D.C. is entering its third week. In order to vote for government spending, Democrats want to include an extension of federal subsidies for health insurance under the Affordable Care Act. Republicans say that can be debated after Congress passes a spending bill. Where is Michigan's congressional delegation in this shutdown? Melissa Nan Burke, Washington bureau chief for the Detroit News, is here to fill us in from D.C. Melissa, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
So yesterday we saw the eighth vote now in the U.S. Senate to reopen the government. The vote failed. First, just fill us in. What is the mood right now in D.C.?
I feel, and everyone I've spoken to feels like it's a bit like Groundhog Day. You wake up in the morning and you listen to the lawmakers on both sides say their piece, and it is the same thing that you heard yesterday. Both sides are very dug in. Everyone is kind of battened down for a long, potentially very long shutdown.
Melissa, where is Michigan's congressional delegation on all of this right now? Is it all just party line?
It is very party line. I would say several of them are physically here in Washington. These two senators obviously are taking part in kind of loop of votes where they are voting against the House passed short-term spending bill. They, like their leadership, want to see some sort of change in the healthcare policy related to, as you mentioned, the Obamacare subsidies. And the Republicans in the House and the Michigan Democrats in the House are also on opposite sides. They're insisting that this is a policy issue that does not need to be dealt with until later in the year when the subsidies actually expire.
Melissa, I'm thinking specifically right now about Democratic Senator Gary Peters. He was one of the Democrats who back in March voted with Republicans to move forward on keeping the government open this past spring. He is not running for re-election, so he can ostensibly vote without concern for political consequences. Is there any sense that Senator Gary Peters' vote or stance might change because of the vote that he had taken back in March?
That it seems a little different this time. He, is again insisting that he wants to see changes, that the costs, the premiums that are going up for a lot of Michiganders is too much, and he's holding the line. He wants to fight for them, and he wants to see some sort of bipartisan agreement. He did vote last time. I think that he sees this differently this round. Now, I will add that I would not surprise me if he is having private conversations with Republican senators to try to come to some agreement that they could make some progress and move things along. Speaker Mike Johnson and the House, however, has said that even if there was such an agreement made by bipartisan senators, he would not put that on the floor.
What are you hearing from the Michigan Congressional delegation when it comes to Michigan-specific arguments during this shutdown?
One thing that I will point to that Senator Alyssa Slotkin is doing, she is trying to make a very Michigan-specific argument by asking constituents to send in copies of their premium letters. So these are like the letters that you're getting from your insurance company, your health insurance company, that tells you how much your premium is going to go up in the new year if you sign up, for plan A, B, or C. And she's redacting those, but putting them out on social media and saying, here's what people are dealing with, trying to kind of make it very personal and real for people. It remains to be seen, whether that would be an effective tactic, but that's a good example of kind of like where the rubber is meeting the road here. And these premium increases are coming sooner rather than later.
Melissa, finally, just quickly, what should we know actually about where Michigan's congressional delegation actually physically is during the shutdown?
Well, the House has not met. They have not been in session for 25 days. That does not mean that they are not here. I have seen members, I've spoken to members that are in town. They are coming and going. They're having meetings and going back to Michigan. And the senators, of course, are still voting, so they have been here. But it is a hard thing to measure. Like, if they're not out there voting every day, going through the hallways, it does make it harder for me as a reporter to find them. But also, they're not having the daily back and forth that they have with their colleagues across the aisle. So there is something lost, but the speaker has argued that there's no work for them to do here. They are going to stay home until the Senate acts.
That is Melissa Nan Burke, Washington Bureau Chief for the Detroit News, joining us from D.C. Melissa, thanks so much.
Thanks, Melissa.
You're welcome.
And that is It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.